you been?
Round the world and I'm going again.
Good evening, book lovers. It's Robert Boyd coming at you with yet another book report. This time I've got a gigantic box set of 3 volumes. Let me pick it up. It's a weighty set of tomes. It's called Hate, and it's a comic book from the 90s, the extremely punk rock name by Peter Bagge, who I've known for, I guess, over 30 years now. I knew of him in the 80s because he did another comic book back then, which I followed religiously, called Neat Stuff. And here's another box set. I'm getting old enough that the things I read on the newsstands have become, collector's items. And Neat Stuff ran from 1985 to 1989. And in 1989, I started working for Fantagraphics Books, the publisher of Hate and Neat Stuff, and also Love and Rockets and 8-Ball and many other great comics. And when I started working for them, they were located in Simi Valley in California, in outskirts of Los Angeles, way outskirts. And but when I moved there to start up with them, they had already decided to move to Seattle, but that move was several months off, so I just sort of stayed in my employer's spare bedroom for a few months without really unpacking my stuff. And then when it came time to do the big move, we all moved together. And this move was kind of insane because, essentially they got several 18-wheelers and tractor trailers and filled them up with their inventory, their office, etc. And also everyone's personal belongings went into these trucks, except for the motorcycles of Mark Thompson and Gary Groth, who was one of the 2 owners of the company, along with Kim Thompson. And so I was dragooned into to transporting the motorcycles up to Seattle by putting them in the back of my truck. And so we lashed them down, so they were pretty safe, although probably if a cop had stopped us, they would have said, "Boys, what are you doing?" But we drove up I-5, and we took a slight detour from I-5 over to Berkeley, because there was an art exhibit there I wanted to see. And then when I say slight, that's actually a big detour, but on the map is only about an inch. Then when we showed up, we didn't really have a specific place to show up to, but we did have Pete Bagge's address, and he was the one who encouraged Fantagraphics to move up to Seattle. He had just moved to Seattle, I don't know, maybe a year or so earlier, and with his wife, who started a restaurant there with her sister, and he was encouraging Fantagraphics that they should change their location, just because Los Angeles is expensive, and they had this very valuable asset in Los Angeles. They owned a house there, and they could sell it and make a huge profit and probably buy 2 houses in Seattle, which is exactly what they did. They bought a house to live in for both Kim Thompson, the other owner, and Gary Groth. Both lived in the house. And I did too, because it was a duplex. And so they let me and Mark Thompson, who was Kim's brother, live in the other half of the duplex for a very sweet rent deal. And but when we got up there, we didn't really know where to go. So we had Pete Bagge's address. So we went and showed up at his house in Ballard, which is a very old-timey Seattle neighborhood, and we knocked on the door, and I think Pete opened. I can't remember if it was Pete or his wife Joanne And we had been driving, I don't know, by that time we'd probably been driving 20 hours straight, and we looked like hell. And I think Pete saw these two psycho, unshaven 20-somethings show up and was like, what the fuck have I gotten myself into? But, he was gracious, and he pointed us to where the new office was going to be, and we went over there and eventually got settled in and unloaded the motorcycles and so on. So this was at the time Neat Stuff. When Pete Bagg had started Neat Stuff, it was a one-man anthology, and the way that would work is that a cartoonist would do multiple stories in their own comic book, and this was a kind of popular format for alternative comics in the 80s and in the 90s. And he was doing that, but one storyline about the Bradleys, a family of living in the suburbs of New Jersey, came to dominate. And the most popular character in the Bradleys was their teenage son, Buddy Bradley. And so Pete was, one thing about Neat Stuff was it was magazine, this is going to get into the weeds of like technical stuff, but it was magazine format, which is roughly 8.5 by 11. And most comic book stores sell comics in a slightly smaller format. So if you buy, an issue of Superman, it's not as big as a regular magazine. The trim size, the outside dimensions. And Pete wanted to do a comic in that size because comic book stores, that's what their fixtures were designed to hold. And it had been magazine size to begin with to set it apart from the average comic book. But he was thinking, okay, this is where the things sell, so let's make it fit their shelves and fit their idea of what a comic book should be. So, or at least, make a small compromise into what comic book store owners think a comic book should be. So he started formulating an idea for a new comic book, a spin-off of Neat Stuff. And he'd been convinced by Kim, although I'm not sure if it was really by Kim, but that's how he's depicted it, that because Buddy Bradley was the most popular character, that it should focus on Buddy Bradley. So Pete was pretty wise. I mean, he'd moved to Seattle, and Seattle was kind of a happening place in '89, although it was before grunge had really hit big, but it was happening. It just wasn't a nationwide phenomenon yet. He decided to have Buddy Bradley move to Seattle as a young adult. And he brought along his friend who had appeared in Neat Stuff, Leonard Brown, who goes by is called Stinky in the comic book. Anyway, it was a great story. And I think initially they were going to call it Hey Buddy, which would have been a funny name, but somehow the name Hate came up. I think it was like, what would be the most offensive thing we could name a comic book? Hate. And then, it's like you come up with a terrible idea and you live with it for a while and suddenly it becomes a good idea. It's like a band calling themselves the Sex Pistols. It was definitely punk rock. And he worked on this comic book in '89, and finally it came out in 1990. Now, I'm gonna one of the initially the first 15 issues were black and white because it was cheaper to print black and white, and Fantagraphics always operated on the thinnest possible margin to stay afloat. But it was successful pretty much right out the gate because, one, it was really good, and I love it. That's why I'm doing this book report. But also because it already had the momentum of Neat Stuff. Not that Neat Stuff was ever super popular, but it had a following, and Peter Bagg had a following. He had a following from Neat Stuff and also from an anthology that he edited for a couple of years in the 80s called Weirdo, which had been started by Robert Crumb, the famous underground cartoonist, who handed handed off the editorial duties to Peter Bagg, and Peter Bagg edited a whole bunch of issues of Weirdo, and he was a great editor, and that gave him a lot of entree into a world that Neat Stuff didn't. So I think the combination of Neat Stuff and Weirdo provided a great groundwork for Hate to start, and being in Seattle and Pete's undeniable humor and excellent writing made it a hit. In the first issue, there's a great story called "Prisoner of Hate Island," where Pete and Kim Thompson and Gary Groth, the publishers, are like stuck on a desert island, and Pete's trying to like decide what to do next, whether to keep on doing Neat Stuff or start a new title, etc., etc. And he's having all these second thoughts on everything. And then at some point, Gary says, Gary says it's time for the ceremony where they're going to blow up a toilet with the number, the 80s scrawled on it, and they do, and they blow up the entire island. Well, the funny thing about that story is, and why I feel a very personal connection to it, is because the idea of blowing up a toilet with the 80s spray painted on it was mine. We were going to have a big New Year's Eve party for 1989, welcoming in the new year of 1990, and Gary had gone off to an Indian reservation to buy as many illegal fireworks as he could, and there was kind of a big field behind the duplex where we lived, way up north of Seattle, and which was kind of a good place to have a party. And at the same time, they were doing some plumbing work in the office, which was a house that they bought in Lake City, which is a neighborhood just north of the University of Washington. And that was the headquarters, and still is the headquarters for Fantagraphics books. And they'd done some plumbing work and gotten rid of an old toilet. And it was just sort of sitting on the back porch. And I said, "Hey, Gary, you know what? We could blow this up for the New Year's Eve party." And he said, "Hey, yeah, it's a good idea. Let's do that." So I liked spray painting things at the time. I was a young punk myself. So I spray painted the 80s on it because we were symbolically blowing up the 80s. And we blew it up, and we had this party. It was a great party, a huge party. A lot of people showed up, and at midnight, we turned the toilet upside down, and I was holding it up. Gary had like this bomb made out of a tennis ball stuffed with gunpowder, I guess, with a fuse coming out of it. He lit the fuse, rolled it under the toilet. I dropped it, ran away, and then it not, I guess, surprisingly at the time, but in retrospect it seems obvious. It didn't just like blow up. It completely shattered into like a million pieces. All that ceramic just became little pebbles, and those pebbles rained down on the neighborhood. Mark, my roommate, who was not a partier and perhaps wisely decided to not partake in the drunken festivities involving fireworks, said that he could hear that tinkling down after midnight. So anyway, that incident got immortalized by Pete. I've always been proud of that. So Pete was here, and he got to be friends with the people who founded Sub Pop, and before they really founded Sub Pop, because before it was Sub Pop, it was a column in a local rock and roll newspaper called The Rocket. Even though Pete was not like a heavy rock and roller kind of guy, he ended up being associated with the rock and roll scene just by, you're going to socialize with somebody, when you're in town, when you're new in town. And he was also friends with the head of, or the director of kind of the local non-profit art space. It was called the Center on Contemporary Art, also known as COCA. And it's sort of similar to Diverse Works here in Houston, and there are centers like nonprofit art centers like this all over America in every big city, and probably in lots of medium-sized cities as well. So Larry was the director of COCA at the time, and he was always having these great art openings at COCA. I think I've mentioned one before where Mark Bidlow did a performance. And he was getting burned out on. Well, we did a big comic show at COCA that we curated and he put it on and helped us tour it all over the country. And so he was pretty successful at that job, but I think he was getting burned out on the fine art scene. And because of the art show, he became friends with Kim and Gary, and he was already friends with Pete Bagg, and so he got hired to be the marketing guy at Fantagraphics, and which was kind of ideal because at that point Hate had started, and Stinky was an important character, a growing character, and it would become even more important. Larry had the brilliant idea of linking Hate to the growing popularity of grunge. And in retrospect, it seems especially brilliant because in 1991, Nirvana came out with Nevermind, and suddenly grunge was a nationwide phenomenon. Everyone knew what grunge was, and everyone knew what Seattle was. Before then, Seattle was kind of an obscure city off in the corner of America that, you could easily not know anything about. So Larry tried to surf that wave as hard as he could, and Pete did as well. At one point, he had Stinky, who was working as a manager for a terrible grunge band or punk band or whatever, and then he ropes Buddy into his schemes, and everything Stinky does is a scheme as opposed to an actual project. And Buddy gets the great idea of saying, "Hey Stinky, instead of you being a manager, why don't you become the lead singer and just go nuts?" And Stinky is flattered by the idea, and so he does, and he becomes Leonard and the Love Gods, which I'm going to show you the cover of the first hardback volume of the book, and you'll see a picture of Leonard and the Love Gods. And so that storyline goes on for several issues, and it coincides with the immense worldwide popularity of grunge. I mean, at that point, Pete Bagg was doing all kinds of grunge-related artwork. He even did a set of grunge pencils that some like school supply store or manufacturer produced to squeeze a few pennies out of the youth of America. I think Pete eventually kind of got tired of the whole Seattle scene. I mean, not the Seattle scene. I mean, he still lives up there, although I think he's moved. It might be down in Tacoma now. But just the whole youth culture of Seattle, and that seemed like a dead end for in terms of stories. I mean, he probably could have kept on making stories, but he decided that he wanted Buddy to move back to New Jersey and to reformat the magazine. So it went from being a black and white underground comic book to being a full color comic book, which was a big move for Fantagraphics. But they were willing to do it because it was by far the best-selling comic that Fantagraphics was putting out, and they would move to the characters would move. Two of the characters, Lisa and Buddy, would move from Seattle back to New Jersey, and the comic book was a little bit different because Pete added more stuff in the back. He would get his friends to do guest strips and so on, and they were really good. And he got a cartoonist who lives in Seattle, who was a co-worker of mine when I worked at Fantagraphics, named Jim Blanchard, to do the inking, and he got his wife to do the coloring, and it looked really good. It wasn't like fancy coloring. It was simple. Everything was flat, but it was good. So for 15 issues, the Buddy and Lisa are in this color comic book set in New Jersey, they have all kinds of the kind of adventures you would have if you were a young couple who'd moved back in with your parents, which is exactly what happened. And you know, just trying to make it in the world in a moderately respectable way. You know, half of a Buddy's friends want to make it in the world by being low-level criminals, but Buddy wants to have like a bourgeois lifestyle. And the thing is, Pete always would say that Buddy was himself 10 years younger. And one thing, you know, he started off as totally an underground cartoonist, but he and Joanne built themselves a completely bourgeois lifestyle. House, kid. I remember their kid would when she was a baby, he would bring her over to the office, let her crawl around. I kept thinking, my God, that kid's gonna get like put her hand through a X-Acto knife blade sometime, because this was back in the pre-computer design era, and there's a lot of like, you know, cutting and pasting of elements of design, and it just, the Fantagraphics office was the definition of grungy, like the old definition. It was just so unclean. I have no idea what it's like now. I should go back sometime, but anyway, then they do that for let's see, through issue 30, and then Pete decided to wrap it up. But he kept going back to the characters and would issue an annual. I'm not sure if it was every year, but every few years at least. And so the third volume in the box set is basically all the annuals collected. So, Hate, a great comic book, a great lens into the world of youth culture in the 90s, and I loved it, and I highly recommend it. So if you're looking to spend a lot of money on a comic book, spend this. And as soon as I got it, I sat down and read all 3 volumes, because I mean, you know, it's kind of easy when you've read them a million times before, because everything's so familiar. The music that started out this was something that actually features into a scene early on in Hate, where Buddy and Stinky are holding a party, and people are dancing, going crazy, and the song playing is Hambone, and I'm not really sure if this version is the one that Pete's referring to, but this version's a great one, by Frankie Lane and Joe Stafford. So, anyway, that's Hate by Peter Bagge. Box set just came out this year. I recommend it. Thanks.